Robinson Crusoe by Daniel DeFoe. Read aloud by Samantha Dunn. Part 5. April 22nd. The next morning I began to consider of means to put this resolve into execution, but I was at a great loss about my tools. I had 3 large axes, an abundance of hatchets, for we carried the hatchets for traffic with the Indians, but with much chopping and cutting knotty hard wood, they were all full of notches and dull. And though I had a grindstone, I could not turn it and grind my tools too. This cost me as much thought as a statesman would have bestowed upon the grand point of politics, or a judge upon the life and death of a man. At length, I contrived a wheel with a string to turn it with my foot, that I might have both my hands at liberty. Note, I have never seen any such thing in England, or at least not to take notice how it was done, though since I have observed it is very common there. Besides that, my grindstone was very large and heavy. This machine cost me a full week's work to bring it to perfection. April 28th, 29th. These 2 whole days I took up in grinding my tools, my machine for turning my grindstone performing very well. April 30th. Having perceived my bread had been low a great while, now I took a survey of it and reduced myself to 1 biscuit a day, which made my heart very heavy. May 1st. In the morning, looking towards the seaside, the tide being low, I saw something lie on the shore bigger than ordinary, and it looked like a cask. When I came to it, I found a small barrel and 2 or 3 pieces of the wreck of a ship, which were driven on shore by the late hurricane. And looking towards the wreck itself, I thought it seemed to lie higher out of the water than it used to. I examined the barrel, which was driven on shore, and soon found it was a barrel of gunpowder, but it had taken water, and the powder was caked as hard as stone. However, I rolled it further on shore for the present, and went on upon the sands as near as I could to the wreck of the ship to look for more. When I came down to the ship, I found it strangely removed. The forecastle, which lay before buried in sand, was heaved up at least 6 feet, and the stern, which was broken to pieces and parted from the rest by the force of the sea soon after I had left rummaging her, was tossed, as it were, up and cast on one side, and the sand thrown so high on that side next to her stern, that whereas there was a great place of water before, so that I could not come within 1/4 of a mile of the wreck without swimming, I could now walk quite up to her when the tide was out. I was surprised with this at first, but soon concluded it must be done by the earthquake. And many things came daily on shore, which the sea had loosened, and which the winds and water rolled by degrees to the land. This wholly diverted my thoughts from the design of removing my habitation, and I busied myself mightily, that day especially, in searching whether I could make any way into the ship. But I found nothing was to be expected of that kind, for that all the inside of the ship was choked up with sand. However, as I had learned not to despair of anything, I resolved to pull everything to pieces that I could of the ship, concluding that everything I could get from her would be of some use or other to me. May 3rd. I began with my saw and cut a piece of beam through, which I thought held some of the upper part or quarter deck together. And when I had cut it through, I cleared away the sand as well as I could from the side which lay highest, but the tide coming in, I was obliged to give over for that time. May 4th. I went a-fishing, but caught not 1 fish that I durst eat of, till I was weary of my sport. When just going to leave off, I caught a young dolphin. I had made me a long line of some rope yarn, but I had no hooks, yet I frequently caught fish enough, as much as I cared to eat, all which I dried in the sun, and eat them dry. May 5th. Worked on the wreck, cut another beam asunder, and brought 3 great fir planks off from the decks, which I tied together and made swim on shore, when the tide of flood came on. May 6th. Worked on the wreck. Got several iron bolts out of her and other pieces of ironwork. Worked very hard and came home very much tired and had thoughts of giving it over. May 7th. Went to the wreck again, but with an intent not to work, but found the weight of the wreck had broke itself down, the beams being cut, that several pieces of the ship seemed to lie loose, and the insides of the hold lay so open that I could see into it, but almost full of water and sand. May 8th. Went to the wreck and carried an iron crow to wrench up the deck, which now lay quite clear of the water and sand. I wrenched open 2 planks and brought them on shore also with the tide. I left the iron crow in the wreck for the next day. May 9th. Went to the wreck and with the crow made my way into the body of the wreck and felt several casks and loosed them with the crow, but could not break them up. I felt also the roll of English lead and could stir it, but it was too heavy to remove. May 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. Went every day to the wreck and got a great deal of pieces of lumber and boards or plank and 200 or 300 weight of iron. May 15th. I carried 2 hatchets to try if I could not cut a piece of the roll of lead by placing the edge of one hatchet and driving it with the other. But as it lay about 1.5 feet in the water, I could not make any blow to drive the hatchet. May 16th. It had blowed hard in the night, and the wreck appeared more broken by the force of the water. But I stayed so long in the woods to get pigeons for food that the tide prevented me going to the wreck that day. May 17th. I saw some pieces of the wreck blown on shore at a great distance, near 2 miles off me, but resolved to see what they were, and found it was a piece of the head, but too heavy for me to bring away. May 24th. Every day to this day I worked on the wreck, and with hard labor I loosened some things so much with the crow that the first blowing tide several casks floated out, and 2 of the seamen's chests. But the wind blowing from the shore, nothing came to land that day but pieces of timber and a hogshead, which had some Brazil pork in it, but the salt water and sand had spoiled it. I continued this work every day to the 15th of June, except the time necessary to get food, which I always appointed, during this part of my employment, to be when the tide was up, that I might be ready when it ebbed out. And by this time I had gotten timber and plank and ironwork enough to have builded a good boat if I had known how. And also, I got at several times, and in several pieces, near 100 weight of the sheet lead. June 16th. Going down to the seaside, I found a large tortoise, or turtle. This was the first I had seen, which it seems was only my misfortune, not any defect of the place or scarcity, for I had happened to be on the other side of the island. I might have had hundreds of them every day, as I found afterwards. June 17. I spent in cooking the turtle. I found in her 70 eggs, and her flesh to me most savory. June 18. Rained all day, and I stayed within. I thought at time the rain felt cold, and I was something chilly, which I knew was not usual in that latitude. June 19th. Very ill and shivering, as if the weather had been cold. June 20. No rest at all, violent pains in my head, and feverish. June 21. Very ill, frightened almost to death with the apprehensions of my sad condition. To be sick, and no help. Prayed to God for the first time since the storm off the hull, but scarce knew what I said or why, my thoughts being all confused. June 22. A little better, but under dreadful apprehensions of sickness. June 23. Very bad again, cold and shivering, and then a violent headache. June 24. Much better. June 25th. An ague very violent. The fit held me 7 hours, cold fit and hot, with faint sweats after it. June 26. Better, and having no victuals to eat, took my gun, but found myself very weak. However, I killed a she-goat, and with much difficulty got it home, and broiled some of it, and eat. I would fain have stewed it and made some broth, but had no pot. June 27. The ague again so violent that I lay abed all day, and neither ate nor drank. I was ready to perish for thirst, but so weak I had no strength to stand up, or to get myself any water to drink. Prayed to God again, but was lightheaded, and when I was not, I was so ignorant that I knew not what to say. Only I lay and cried, Lord, look upon me! Lord, pity me! Lord, have mercy upon me! I suppose I did nothing else for 2 or 3 hours, till the fit wearing off, I fell asleep, and did not wake till far in the night. When I waked, I found myself much refreshed, but weak and exceeding thirsty. However, as I had no water in my whole habitation, I was forced to lie till morning, and went to sleep again. In this second sleep, I had this terrible dream. I thought that I was sitting on the ground and saw a man come down from a great black cloud in a flame of light. When he stood on the earth, it shook as it had done a few days since, and all the world to me was full of fire. Well, he came up and said, As I see that all these things have not brought thee to pray, now thou shalt die. When I woke and found it was a dream, weak and faint, I was in dread all day, lest my fit should come on. Too ill to get out with my gun, I sat on the shore to think, and thus ran my thoughts. What is this sea which is all around me? And whence is it? There can be no doubt that this hand that made it, the air, the earth, the sky, and who is that? It is God, who hath made all things. Well, then, if God had made all things, it must be he who guides them. And if so, no one thing in the whole range of his works can take place, and he not know it. Then God must know how sick and sad I am, and he wills me to be here. Oh, why hath God done this to me? Well, then some voice would seem to say, Dost thou ask why God has done this to thee? Ask why thou wert not shot by the Moors, who came on board the ship and took the lives of thy mates. Ask why thou wert not torn by the beasts of prey on the coasts. Ask why thou didst not go down into the deep sea with the rest of the crew, but didst come to this isle and art safe. A sound sleep then fell on me, and when I woke, it must have been 3 o'clock the next day by the rays of the sun. Nay, it may have been more than that, for I think that this must have been the day that I did not mark on my post, as I have since found that there was one notch too few. I now took from my store the book of God's word, which I had brought from the wreck, not one page of which I had as yet read. My eyes fell on 5 words that would seem to have been put there for my good at this time. So well did they cheer my faint hopes and touch the true source of my fears. They were these: I will not leave thee. And they have dwelt in my heart to this day. I laid down the book to pray. My cry was, O Lord, help me to love and learn thy ways. This was the first time in all my life that I had felt a sense that God was near and heard me. As for my dull life here, it was not worth a thought, for now a new strength had come to me, and there was a chance in my griefs, as well as in my joys. I had been now in this unhappy island above 10 months, all which made it very wholesome, and also very cool and refreshing. I found now I had business enough to gather and carry home, and I resolved to lay up a store, as well of grapes as limes and lemons, to furnish myself for the wet season, which I knew was approaching. In order to this, I gathered a great heap of grapes in one place, and a lesser heap in another place, and a great parcel of limes and lemons in another place. And taking a few of each with me, I traveled homeward, and resolved to come again and bring a bag or sack, or what I could make, to carry the rest home. Accordingly, having spent 3 days in this journey, I came home, so I must now call my tent and my cave. But before I got thither, the grapes were spoiled. The richness of the fruits and the weight of the juice, having broken them and bruised them, they were good for little or nothing. As to the limes, they were good, but I could bring but a few. The next day, being the 19th, I went back, having made me 2 small bags to bring home my harvest. But I was surprised when, coming to my heap of grapes, which were so rich and fine when I gathered them, I found them all spread about, trod to pieces and dragged about, by some here, some there, and abundance eaten and devoured. By this I concluded there was some wild creatures thereabouts, which had done this, but what they were, I knew not. However, as I found that there was no laying them up on heaps, and no carrying them away in a sack, but that one way they would be destroyed, and that the other way they would be crushed with their own weight, I took another course, for I gathered a large quantity of the grapes and hung them up upon the out branches of the trees, that they might cure and dry in the sun. And as for the limes and lemons, I carried as many back as I could stand under. When I came home from this journey, I contemplated with great pleasure the fruitfulness of that valley and the pleasantness of the situation, the security from storms on that side, the water in the wood, and concluded that I had pitched upon a place to fix my abode, which was by far the worst part of the country. Upon the whole, I began to consider of removing my habitation, and to look out for a place equally safe as where I now was situate, if possible, in that pleasant, fruitful part of the island. This thought ran long in my head, and I was exceeding fond of it for some time, the pleasantness of the place tempting me. But when I came to a nearer view of it, and to consider that I was now by the seaside, where it was at least possible that something might happen to my advantage, and, by the same ill fate that brought me hither, might bring some other unhappy wretches to the same place, and though it was scarce probable that any such thing should ever happen, yet to enclose myself among the hills and the woods on the center of the island was to anticipate my bondage, and to render such an affair not only improbable, but impossible, and that therefore I ought not by any means to remove. However, I was so enamored of this place that I spent much of my time there for the whole remaining part of the month of July, and though upon second thoughts I resolved as above not to remove, yet I built me a little kind of a bower, and surrounded it at a distance with a strong fence, being a double hedge as high as I could reach, well staked and filled between with brushwood. And here I lay very secure, sometimes 2 or 3 nights together, always going it over with a ladder, as before, so that I fancied now I had my country house and my sea-coast house, and this work took me up to the beginning of August. I had but newly finished my fence, and began to enjoy my labor, but the rains came on, and made me stick close to my first habitation, for there I had made me a tent like the other, with a piece of a sail, and spread it very well. Yet I had not the shelter of a hill to keep me from storms, nor a cave behind me to retreat into when the rains were extraordinary. About the beginning of August, as I said, I had finished my bower and began to enjoy myself. The 3rd of August, I found the grapes I had hung up were perfectly dried, and indeed were excellent good raisins of the sun. So I began to take them down from the trees, and it was very happy that I did so, for the rains which followed would have spoiled them, and I had lost the best part of my winter food, for I had above 200 large bunches of them. No sooner had I taken them all down and carried most of them home to my cave, but it began to rain, and from hence, which was the 14th of August, it rained more or less every day till the middle of October, and sometimes so violently that I could not stir out of my cave for several days. In this season, I was much surprised with the increase of my family. I had been concerned for the loss of one of my cats, who ran away from me, or, as I thought, had been dead, and I heard no more tale or tidings of her till, to my astonishment, she came home about the end of August with 3 kittens. From the 14th of August to the 26th, incessant rain, so that I could not stir, and was now very careful not to be much wet. In this confinement, again to be straitened for food, But venturing out twice, I one day killed a goat, and the last day, which was the 26th, found a very large tortoise, which was a treat to me, and my food was regulated thus. I eat a bunch of raisins for my breakfast, a piece of the goat's flesh, or of the turtle for my dinner, broiled, or, to my great misfortune, I had no vessel to boil or stew anything, and 2 or 3 of the turtle's eggs for my supper. During this confinement in my cover by the rain, I worked daily 2 or 3 hours at enlarging my cave, and by degrees worked it on towards one side, till I came to the outside of the hill, and made a door, or way out, which came beyond my fence or wall. And so I came in and out this way. But I was not perfectly easy at laying so open, for as I had managed myself before, I was in a perfect enclosure, whereas now I thought I lay exposed and open for anything to come in upon me. And yet I could not perceive that there was any living thing to fear, the biggest creature that I had yet seen upon the island being a goat. September 30th. I was now come to the unhappy anniversary of my landing. I cast up the notches of my post and found that I had been on the shore 365 days. I kept this day as a solemn fast, setting it apart to religious exercise, prostrating myself on the ground with the most serious humiliation, confessing my sins to God, acknowledging his righteous judgments upon me, and praying to him to have mercy on me through Jesus Christ. And having not lasted the least refreshment for 12 hours, even till the going down of the sun, I then eat a biscuit cake and a bunch of grapes, and went to bed, finishing the day as I had begun it. I had all this time observed no Sabbath day, for as at first I had no sense of religion upon my mind, I had, after some time, omitted to distinguish the weeks by making a longer notch than ordinary for the Sabbath day, and so did not really know what any of the days were. But now, having cast up the days as above, I found I had been there a year, so I divided it into weeks and set apart every 7th day for a Sabbath, though I found at the end of my account I had lost a day or 2 in my reckoning. A little after this, my ink began to fail me, and so I contented myself to use it more sparingly, and to write down only the most remarkable events of my life, without continuing a daily memorandum of other things. The rainy season and the dry season began now to appear regular to me, and I learned to divide them so as to provide for them accordingly. But I bought all of my experience before I had it, and this, I am going to relate, was one of the most discouraging experiments that I made at all. I have mentioned that I had saved the few ears of barley and rice, which I had so surprisingly found sprung up, as I thought, of themselves, and believed there were about 30 stalks of rice, and about 20 of barley. And now I thought it a proper time to sow it after the rains, the sun being in its southern position, going from me. Accordingly, I dug up a piece of ground as well as I could with my wooden spade, and dividing it into 2 parts, I sowed my grain. But, as I was sowing, it casually occurred to my thoughts that I would not sow it all at first, because I did not know when was the proper time for it. So I sowed about 2/3 of the seed, leaving about a handful of each. It was a great comfort to me afterwards that I did so, for not 1 grain of that I sowed this time came to anything. For the dry months following, the earth having had no rain after the seed was sown, it had no moisture to assist its growth, and never came up at all till the wet season had come again, and then it grew as if it had been but newly sown. Finding my first seed did not grow, which I easily imagined was by the drought, I sought for a moister piece of ground to make another trial in, and I dug up a piece of ground near my new bower, and sowed the rest of my seed in February, a little before the vernal equinox. And this, having the rainy months of March and April to water it, sprung up very pleasantly, and yielded a very good crop. But having part of the seed left only, and not daring to sow all that I had but a small quantity at last, my whole crop not amounting to above a half a peck of each kind. But by this experiment I was made master of my business, and knew exactly when the proper season was to sow, and that I might expect 2 seed times and 2 harvests every year. While the corn was growing, I made a little discovery, which was of use to me afterwards. As soon as the rains were over and the weather began to settle, which was about the month of November, I made a visit up the country to my bower, where, though I had not been in some months, yet I found all things just as I left them. The circle or double hedge which I had made was not only firm and entire, but the stakes which I had cut out of some trees that grew thereabouts were all shot out and grown with long branches, as much as a willow tree usually shoots the first year after lopping its head. I could not tell what tree to call it that these stakes were cut from. I was surprised, and yet very well pleased, to see young trees grow, and I pruned them and led them up to grow as much alike as they could. And it is scarce credible how beautiful a figure they grew into in 3 years, so that though the hedge made a circle of about 25 yards in diameter, yet the trees, for much as I might call them, soon covered it, and it was a complete shade, sufficient to lodge under all the dry season. This made me resolve to cut some more stakes and make me a hedge like this, in a semicircle, around my wall. I mean that of my first dwelling, which I did, and placing the trees or stakes in a double row, at about 8 yards distance from my first fence, they grew presently, and were at first a fine cover to my habitation, and afterwards served for a defense also, as I shall observe in its order. I found now that the seasons of the year might generally be divided, not into summer and winter, as in Europe, but into the rainy seasons and the dry seasons, which were generally thus: half of February, March, and half of April is the rainy, the sun being then on, or near the equinox. Half April, May, June, and July, and half of August, dry, the sun being then to the north of the line. Half of August, September, and half of October, rainy, the sun being then come back. And half of October, November, December, January, and half of February, dry, the sun being then to the south of the line. The rainy season sometimes held longer or shorter as the winds happened to blow, but this was the general observation I made. After I had found by experience the ill consequence of being abroad in the rain, I took care to furnish myself with provisions beforehand, that I might not be obliged to go out, and I sat within doors as much as possible during the wet months. In this time I found much employment, and very suitable also to the time, for I found great occasion that many things which I had no way to furnish myself with but by hard labor and constant application. Particularly, I tried many ways to make myself a basket, but all the twigs I could get for the purpose proved so brittle that they would do nothing. It proved of excellent advantage to me now that when I was a boy I used to take a great delight in standing at a basket maker's in town where my father lived, to see them make their wickerware, and being, as boys usually are, very officious to help, and a great observer of the manner how they worked those things, and sometimes lending a hand, I had by this means full knowledge of the methods of it, that I wanted nothing but the materials. When it came into my mind that the twigs of the trees from whence I cut my stakes that grew might possibly be as tough as the sallows and willows and osiers in England, and I resolved to try. Accordingly, the next day I went to my country house, as I called it, and cutting some of the smaller twigs, I found them to my purpose as much as I could desire. Whereupon I came the next time prepared with a hatchet to cut down a quantity, which I soon found, for there was plenty of them. These I set up to dry within my circle or hedge, and when they were fit for use, I carried them to my cave. And here, during the next season, I employed myself in making, as well as I could, a great many baskets, both to carry earth or to lay up anything as I had occasion. And though I did not finish them very handsomely, yet I made them sufficiently serviceable for my purpose. And thus, afterwards, I took care never to be without them, and as my wickerware decayed, I made more. Especially, I made strong, deep baskets to place my corn in, instead of sacks, when I should come to have any quantity of it. Having mastered this difficulty and employed a world of time about it, I bestowed myself to see, if possible, how to supply 2 wants. I had no vessels to hold anything that was liquid, except 2 runlets, which were almost full, and some glass bottles, some of the common size, and others which were case bottles square for the holding of waters, spirits, etc. I had not so much as a pot to boil anything, except a great kettle, which I saved out of the ship, and which was too big for such use as I desired it, viz., to make broth and stew a bit of meat by itself. The second thing I would fain have had was a tobacco pipe, but it was impossible for me to make one. However, I found a contrivance for that, too, at last. I employed myself in wanting my second rows of stakes or piles, and in this wicker working all summer or dry season, when another business took me up more time than it could be imagined I could spare.